Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So first, I just want to thank everyone who is attending the Student Support Summit. We really appreciate everyone who's hopping in to learn more about the transferable traits of teaching. Just a little housekeeping. If you want to activate live captioning, you can go ahead and click live transcript at the bottom and show subtitle if you would like that. Also, before we get started, the presenters would like for you to know that if you have any questions throughout, you can put the questions in the chat. After each of the presenter slides, they'll take a little break and see if you have any questions. If not, they'll keep rolling through. At the end, they do have time. They have specific discussion questions for everyone, and then also time for you to ask questions as well. So again, transferable traits of teaching, and this is Priscilla, Lauren, and Molly. Go ahead and take it away, ladies.
All righty, thank you, Carly. So we are going to get started with our slides. So again, I am Priscilla Herrera. I'm a learning specialist here at LSU. My educational background, I'm a bachelor's of social work that I got from East Carolina University, where I played softball, and then I got my master's of education in coaching, sport, recreation, fitness administration. My teaching experience, I started off as a paraprofessional, and I worked from PE to I ended my career teaching as a special education English inclusion teacher. And I've worked with pre-K 3 all the way up to high school. And I taught in the state of Texas.
Hi, I'm Lauren Barker. I am a learning specialist here at LSU, have been for almost a year and a half now. Prior to that, I did get my undergrad at Louisiana Tech. I did a double major in history and sociology. I then went on to LSU and earned my Master of Arts in Teaching, spent 10 years teaching in the state of Louisiana, and found out about a tutoring position here at LSU in 2019, and the rest is history.
And I'm Molly. I am a tutorial graduate assistant here at LSU as well. I'm also interning with the ESS department. I got my bachelor's at North Dakota State, and I graduate with my Master of Education in School Counseling next month. And I taught in Louisiana for 3 years. I taught just about every elementary school subject for grades 3 through 5.
All righty. Lauren is going to take us through our session objectives, but if you guys could just do us a favor in the chat, can you just let us know kind of what your title is, if you are coming from a teaching background, or maybe coming from higher ed as an academic advisor or a learning specialist, just so we can know how to tailor our presentation and kind of who our audience members are.
All right, and while y'all do that, our session objectives today, there's a few things that we really want to highlight today. First are the various roles and responsibilities that teachers and learning specialists share. There's a lot of overlap, as it turns out. We also want to discuss a few ways that will help people from other levels of the education field make that transition to the world of educational support services. And then, because so many of us have or will eventually participate in the search and hiring process of future learning specialists, we really want to help answer or guide any questions you have for people looking to make the same transition that we all have. And so to start us off with this, Priscilla is going to talk about a very key part of both careers, and that's going to be behavior management.
Yeah, so it seems like most of our audience are coming from higher ed. So as I go through behavior management, I'm just going to let you know kind of what that looks like in the teacher's perspective, and then how that looks like in our learning specialist job. So with teachers, following a behavioral plan, if the student has it, is something that we would do as teachers. And then setting classroom expectation plays a role in our students' behavior. So teachers have expectations that are clearly stated, whether that's their outline on the board or they practice routines, especially with younger students. Routines are very important. So practicing routines for our students, and some of that behavior with the expectations comes the policies, either the policies that you have in place as a teacher or the policies that the schools have in place. So it may look like, if a student is having a behavior, I may have a one-on-one conversation with them. And then if the behavior is continuing, then I may go and contact an AP, an assistant principal, or a dean of students, whoever's in charge of behavior at that time. If the behavior still does not get any better, then I may need to contact their parents and get parents involved in that way. And that's kind of what it looks like on the school side. Schools also have behavioral policies that teachers need to follow. But from the learning specialist side, we meet with our students one-on-one. So one of the key things to do is to ask your students, how is your day going? You know, that can give you a key on how they may behave during that. They may be having a bad day, and it's important to know those things before you start your session. As learning specialists, we are able to set our clear expectations for our behaviors that we allow in our classroom, so or in our offices. So if a student comes in and they're always on their phone, or they just don't want to do the work, we can have those one-on-one conversations because we meet with them on a one-on-one scenario. The biggest thing that I think we've seen with the younger students is mainly being on their phone. And a lot of that is, if a student is used to being on their phone all day long, expecting them to not be on their phone from one day to the next may not be a realistic expectation. So setting up the expectation and letting them know, like, hey, being on your phone is a distraction, and we need to be able to maximize our time that we have here. So if you can work for 10 to 15 minutes, I'll give you a 2-minute break, and you can do what you want during that break, whether that's going to get snacks or whether that is going to be on your phone, but you need to work for the 15 minutes to earn, you know, that break that we may be able to give them. Another thing that we have here at LSU when it comes to behavior is if a student is showing up late, we have no-show policy. So not only will their advisor be notified on the no-show, their coaches will be notified that they were late. We can also mark them as a behavioral no-show if the behavior continues to happen with our students. And following that, we are in constant communication with our academic advisors, so we're letting them know, hey, this is a behavior I'm experiencing with my student. How can we get this fixed? They may know if a student is going through something personal, maybe outside of academics, outside of school. The advisor would be able to let us know if that's something. They also are a liaison with our coaches, so they'll let our coaches know that the student is having trouble on the academic side. And so for us, when it comes to teachers and when it comes to learning specialists, the similarity is, you know, you're working with the advisor. And if you are a teacher, you're working with your principal, you're always in collaboration, which is similar on both ends and both jobs. How this skill transfers to teaching, if someone was on the job and they're interviewing for a learning specialist and they were a teacher, then it's giving examples of the expectations that you may set in your classroom. How do you set these examples? What were some of the maybe implementation that you have with these students? Do they get breaks? Do you have frequent check-ins with them? We also need to make sure that we are documenting with them, document different types of examples that you use so that you're able to know what to write or what to say. And then small group sessions, that's going to be one of our biggest key. We work a lot with small groups, not big classrooms, as learning specialists. So how did you manage small group sessions? And then however you manage that, it's going to be similar to the way that we manage that as learning specialists. And then just documentation with behavior. So we document as learning specialists after every session what our students did, what our goals and objectives are. And in that can be behavior if we are experiencing some type of behavior difficulty. And as teachers, we also document, and especially if they have an IEP or 504, which I'll get a little bit more into in our next slide, we also have to document as well. So that is behavior management. I don't know if we have any questions regarding behavior management, but if not, I will move on. So our next slide, we are going to talk about students with exceptionalities. And so for us as teachers, what that means is we may have students that have IEPs or 504 plans. IEP is different than a 504. IEP is specialized instruction, and the student receives related services in their IEP. Of 504s, the student is receiving accommodations to ensure that they have academic success and access to the learning environment. So We deal with both. We deal with students here as a learning specialist with students that have had IEPs or have had IO4s, 504s. So as teachers, by law, we have to give these accommodations, right? We have to document when we gave the accommodation, what specialized instruction are they getting? Did they receive that accommodation? How many minutes per the day did they receive that accommodation? So a lot of the time, a lot of it is documenting it, and a lot of it as teachers, we are experienced in providing these accommodations for our students. We also work with students with learning disabilities as teachers and both as learning specialists. We need to collaborate with our special education teacher and decide which accommodation will work best for our students. And as a learning specialist, we need to collaborate with our academic advisors to see what works best for our students and what do we think, how many times a week do they need to meet with us, or maybe what classes are better for them to be in. And documentation is key on both ends for that. Now, on the learning specialist side, one of the things that we also do is have students go through psychoeducational testing. So incoming students that are identified to go through that testing will allow us to give us a better perspective of where they are academically. And we can understand what specific areas they need help in on that side. We attend ODS meetings or when they register for disability services, if they have the ability to do that, if they receive any accommodations. And then we also need to collaborate and discuss with advisors again. Now, that's if we are given permission, we will discuss the findings with our advisors and give them, they'll ask us for help or just collaborate with them on what classes they may need to be in, which ones would be successful. If I have a student that maybe struggles in reading, a class that is reading intensive may not be the best for that student. We also have to review our testing results with our students. So after they go through that testing, and then working with students with academic challenges doesn't just mean learning disabilities. It doesn't just mean that every student we meet with has to have a learning disability, but there are other things that can challenge our student. It can be their background. It can be the lack of support that they received in high school. So there's a lot of different things that can have a student working with a learning specialist. And then we have to ensure that our students are receiving these accommodations from their professors. So it's conversations with our students. Hey, are you getting your notes? Or, are you recording your classes like you're supposed to be? Like, are you guys doing these accommodations in the classroom? And how that skill transfers is, if you're a teacher, you want to try and be in the IEP or the 504 meetings. If you're interviewing a teacher, maybe ask them what is their experience with IEPs and 504s. What are some examples of 504s that maybe accommodations that you used? Keep track of the different accommodations if you're a teacher so that you can provide those examples, and then speak about the documentation that you would use for 504s and IEPs. And being in those meetings for IEPs and 504s allows you to see how maybe the special education teacher would distribute these results and give them the results. Like, what wording do they use? How do they deliver these, results to them? Do we have any questions on students with exceptionalities? All righty, I'm going to pass it on over to Lauren, and she's going to talk a little bit about data.
All righty. Okay. So with teaching, it was incredibly data driven, especially for me at the high school level. It's a very different experience now that I'm here, but I've definitely found that the data I worked with as a high school teacher has immensely impacted my understanding, as well as how I analyze data since I've switched fields. I know when I was a teacher, every single school year began pulling test scores from middle school and establishing setting growth goals for each and every one of my students when it came to district and state testing. So additionally, we were also expected to track these goals for a variety of reasons. Probably the most useful was that we would analyze what skills were being mastered, what skills were not, and then that analysis would give us the opportunity to begin a reteaching or remediation process. We were also required to report our testing data to our administrators because testing data at the high school level, at least in the state of Louisiana, is a huge part of every school's performance score. So those kinds of things was annual, and it's going to transfer over when we look at incoming data for our student athletes. We also did a lot with grading and GPA tracking. A lot of my students, especially, towards the end of the semester anyways, really were concerned with their GPA. What quality points were they having the potential to earn? and then kind of maybe setting some goals, sometimes a little too late, but setting goals to kind of get to where they needed to be. So that kind of data tracking helped us to be aware of our students, where they were, and how could we meet them there. On the other side of things, though, as a learning specialist, definitely a lot of data to collect and analyze so that we can better understand our students as well as provide for them. Here at LSU, we have a whole process that literally begins at the time that they commit and apply to the institution, continues once they get here, continues when they, if and when they get on caseload, if and when they graduate from caseload, and any time that they are in our building or at our university. So the way we look at data and the reason we look at data varies absolutely from high school to learning specialists and educational support, but there's absolutely skills that translate over. So I want to mention SMART goals for sure. We have a lot of development of that as teachers. Maybe back then we didn't necessarily call them SMART goals all the time if we're focusing mostly on testing as teachers, but absolutely focusing on goals for our students, setting them, having that time constraint on how to get there is definitely a big part of data when it comes to teaching as well as learning specialists. Another thing that I want to mention is test administration. Most teachers are required to go through all of the training to administer or at least proctor standardized testing. And that can be very beneficial when it comes to the evaluation process that we have. I know our learning profile system, we use the RAP5 as well with the KTEA for math so that we can analyze our students' strengths and weaknesses. And so being able to have that testing background and testing experience is really helpful for not only administering the test, but being able to analyze that data that we get back to identify their strengths and weaknesses. Which is really beneficial for really helping our students get to where they want to be, where they need to be, and knowing how we can get them there. And then lastly, tracking and organizing our data is very, very inclusive and all-encompassing here, whether it comes back to looking at test scores and strengths and weaknesses on a transcript from high school, looking at their maths, their Englishes, knowing where are we going to need tutoring going forward, looking at inclusion rubrics, pulls all of that data in, and then in addition to the data we get from their learning profiles so that we can decide what students may need a learning specialist once they are here in the building with us, and prior to any kind of psychoeducational testing that we might identify a need for as well. So then again, we one more step at the end of each semester, we do our continuing caseload. And so you pull that same data alongside with how are they growing and improving in all of those areas, with whether it be English, math, study skills, reading, writing, all of those kinds of things. So it really helps to kind of understand. It helps us to combine the information, figure out what our strengths and weaknesses are that we've identified at various levels, and understand where our students need to go. So, and then again, we share all of this data, well, to a certain extent, with our advisors. And so understanding from the educator side what information is relevant versus what necessarily isn't needed by the advisors can really come back to being able to read a transcript, being able to analyze their strengths and weaknesses from these different data sources. And that's really it. If there aren't any questions, I'll hand it off.
All right, and I'll jump in. So next, talking a little bit about curriculum development. When it comes to being a learning specialist, a lot of the work is one-on-one with students, but there's also a really big piece of it that is involved in the different programming that an educational support services department provides. So as a teacher, curriculum development often involves adapting and implementing scripted curriculum. So sometimes districts will purchase these curriculums, and those are already designed to meet national or state standards. But even though they're already designed that way, we know that as teachers, we have to adapt lessons to meet the needs of the students that are actually sitting in front of us in those classrooms. So it might come all the way done, but we have a bunch of little adjustments to make sure that it's meeting the needs of our students. For those of us that don't have the curriculum scripted for us, we also have to develop our own. So we use state standards, and this allows us to guide the focus of our planning and pacing throughout a year. It allows us to make sure that even though we only have a small chunk of time, we're able to get every single one of those objectives in throughout the year, making sure that our pacing is on track. They also provide a really nice set of goals that allow objectives to be developed for individual units and lessons. Another thing that I engaged in personally in my district, we did vertical planning. So this allowed all of the teachers at the elementary school level that taught math to work together, and we could see the progression all the way from kindergarten all the way up to 8th grade. So we're able to see where are the gaps, where do I come into play, what role do I have in the student making progress through 8th grade, and what role do I have in their preparation for high school and beyond. Teachers also then use curriculum to develop unit plans. So this means we are taking those standards, we're breaking them down into, you can go back one more slide, Priscilla. We are breaking them down into objectives, and then we are creating a set of lessons that will gradually build on each other to reach our learning goals. Our unit plans always include assessments and data collection methods, as Lauren talked about, that are used to make sure that we are effective and that we don't have to go back and reteach anything. As learning specialists, beyond just, again, working one-on-one with students, we work in programs. So learning specialists are often tasked with implementing literacy, math, or study skills curriculums. They address any of these skills gaps that student athletes may bring in their college experience, to their college experience. We identify resources. Priscilla is a great example of this, identifying resources like textbooks that have activities that can be adapted to design intervention programs. Some of the examples here at LSU, we have our ROAR program, which, as I mentioned, Priscilla is currently piloting to help with reading comprehension. And then we also have Mike, which is a math preparation program that is designed to prepare student athletes that are entering a specific math pathway in LSU's degree programs. And learning specialists also are heavily involved in the tutor and assistant development programs. So they might have a role in leading tutor trainings and making sure that they receive professional development, or for graduate assistants like me or interns that may be in your department. They're very much involved in creating learning plans for those students that are trying to make it to the next step. And then program development. So we often also are tasked with developing programs in our department and across departments. So this could be a bridge program or a mentor program. And learning specialists use their skills with those standards and those objectives to be able to make sure that they design programming, they design activities, they design delivery, get the guest speakers that they need to reach those objectives. And then as far as transferring the skills, looking for for teachers trying to make the jump, getting involved in a bridge program. I know that's how I made the transition. I know Lauren worked our bridge program as well. So it's a really great way to see what that programming looks like and see how you can transfer your skills. That's another great thing to ask about if you are looking to hire a teacher. Do they have experience in that? What does their programming experience at that level look like? Another great way is attending those tutor trainings. If you can become a tutor in higher education as a teacher, that's a great way to get involved. Maybe it's not at an athletic academic center. Maybe it's just at a university. Maybe it's just at a private institution that's providing tutoring to students that are in higher education. And then attending any tutor trainings that are available. Obviously, it will give lots of experience, but will also help you see what that looks like, so that when it's your turn as a learning specialist to help develop that, you know what it can look like and what you want to say. And then sharing knowledge of intervention curriculums. As Priscilla mentioned earlier too, there's a lot of work working individually with students or working on interventions in small groups. So if you're interviewing a teacher, asking about those experiences and what their lesson plans look like, how do they close those gaps? And then understanding what those remediation activities could look like in academic centers. Even though you might have taught at an elementary school level like me, sometimes the gaps that I have are the exact ones that our students need, and that vertical planning can really help close them. And then we'll move on to lesson planning. Perfect. So lesson planning is just a little bit, it's very similar to curriculum development, just zoomed in a little bit more. So often as a teacher, most of our work done is whole group lesson planning. It's those big classroom lessons that we deliver. And as Priscilla mentioned, we have students that have accommodations in our classroom. So while we're teaching to a student that might be on grade level with no accommodations needed, we also have students that have 504s in that same classroom. We also have students that have IEPs in that same classroom. Sometimes we have paraprofessionals that are pushing into the classroom. And then there's some students who just grasp different material at a slower rate, so adapting for each of them. The lessons also have to provide opportunities for students who are understanding the material to work further. So not only are we working at maybe the lower end of the spectrum, we're also having to work on the spectrum that's a little bit more advanced, and making sure that our classroom lessons touch every single student. Teachers also adapt our lesson plans to our classroom routine. So this means that we have repeated opening activities. Usually we're delivering content, there's opportunities to practice, and often a short assessment or some type of conclusion. Teachers also engage in small group and individual intervention planning. When we do those assessments and we find gaps, we have to make sure we come up with ways to close them. So this involves planning small group activities, highly targeted short lessons that will close those gaps in knowledge or performance that we're seeing on those formative assessments. And then backwards planning. So teachers utilize backwards planning when we're developing our lessons. This relies a lot on developing that big summative assessment that we have at the end of the unit. What are the goals? How are we going to test them there? And then working backwards. So how can we build lessons that make sure that our students can do this test at the end? And how can we make sure that we're tracking along the way? What are those formative assessments going to look like as we go to make sure we don't just get to the end and have to start all over again, catching our mistakes as we go. And then as a learning specialist, as I mentioned before, we do other staff or assistant training. Maybe it's tutors. They often are heavily involved in tutorial programs, and they're tasked with developing the training for tutors and staff, building lessons on tutoring best practices, and then also ensuring that our tutor trainings are modeling the strategies that we want tutors to be able to practice. Another way it translates is structuring our sessions. So learning specialists aren't always going to create big lesson plans for student sessions, but we are going to develop repeated routines. So this includes checking in with our students, modeling the new strategies. They know when their practice time is going to be, and then always closing and setting a goal for that upcoming session, finding ways to gauge their understanding throughout the sessions, much like it looks in a classroom in small group intervention. Teachers also set objectives for their sessions and document them, much like teachers do. And then differentiating our strategies. So just like in a classroom, when we have to differentiate to everybody in front of us, learning specialists have a huge toolbox of tools that we can use. We might have several students that are in the same classes, maybe working on similar assignments, but our sessions could look much different depending on the needs of and understanding what strategies the student sitting in front of us might need. And then as far as translating the skill, one really important thing to either ask about if you're interviewing or to share as a teacher is highlighting those small group or individual interventions that they've developed, particularly differentiation for students with learning disabilities or those that were really significantly below grade level. Of also applying the importance of a classroom routine to the routine of an individual session. The routine is such a big part of what a lesson plan looks like, and that can really help students, particularly those with learning disabilities, feel comfortable and really get into a rhythm when they're working with you. And then also sharing the ways that objectives and assessments are used as a teacher. A lot of times teachers, we find that it's a requirement of the administration or the district to have your objectives posted, but really we do use them so much in our own planning. So making sure that as a teacher, you're articulating how you truly use those objectives and those assessments. And also as somebody who might be interviewing someone, making sure that you see maybe how they really use objectives. So not just having them up in their classroom to meet a requirement of the district, but really how did they use them and how did that guide their work?
Okay, so all of us having been through an educational background and then also applying, interviewing, and ultimately getting jobs as a learning specialist, we've encountered a variety of questions that you have to answer as a teacher interested in making these transitions. We kind of try to narrow it down to the big three so that if there are others that y'all have that you would want to ask a teacher or have for potential people, then we were going to open that up next. But just to kind of cover a few major ones, the first question that we've seen a lot is how you switch from setting boundaries with a large group of students to a smaller group of students and very different communication expectations. I'll use myself as an example, but we do work to establish roles and boundaries very, very quickly, which is similar. But there is absolutely some different varieties of how we communicate, whether it's, GAs and students or learning specialists and students, and honestly, even just within our own sports. For just to use myself for the example, I work with men's basketball as well as football. The way I communicate with my students is not only different from how I would have communicated with my high schoolers, but it's very different even just with each of those two sports. One of the biggest things that I've definitely found that I would mention or ask about of potential teachers is being able to create expectations for when they're allowed to reach out and expect that we'll actually answer, now that many of our students are allowed to have our personal number, our work phone number. And then they just have to learn to set those boundaries and how you establish those boundaries about maybe not calling at 2 a.m. when they're finally getting around to their assignments and things like that. So that's one that I know I had to address personally once I made this shift. Another big question that we see is, how do you foster the growth of your independent learners? Whereas many of these students at the college level, you may have them for one semester, you may have them for their entire career at your institution. And then at high school level or other levels of education, you have them, it's just one and done. You may have them for one semester, 1 year, but that's usually about it. So it's really imperative to talk about or ask about a person's ability to understand where the student is, being able to collaborate on setting goals together, and then establishing a plan to achieve those goals. And meeting them where they're at, I think, is one of the key words that I always try to throw out there when I'm talking about working with my students. Just knowing who they are, understanding who they are, being able to differentiate, and we've talked about this as a transferable skill for sure, but being able to differentiate their steps towards success, because what one student's path looks like is going to be totally different from your next student. And that differentiation, as well as scaffolding, being able to build up to your goals and your success, was absolutely something that's highlighted in professional development for teachers. And then our third big question is, how will you be able to handle working with students who have significant academic deficits? And this can include your special admits. And the answer for, I think hopefully everyone comes with the word patience. It's very key to be able to be there for that student, to understand them, to understand their past, their experiences. And I think that's something really great for former teachers, because they've been in that exact setting that these students are coming from. So they see the struggles, they see the gaps, they see the disservices and things like that. And so teachers are going to very often be so very ready to work with students to discover strategies that work specifically for them. And I know that for all three of us, having been in the education field, we definitely know that those gaps can happen at every level of education, but we do also have a lot of background and training in how to close those gaps. And then the other question that I don't think anybody has ever not been asked is, why are teachers leaving the classroom? So just to kind of give you a feel, we're all going to tell you why we left the classroom, and then I'll let Priscilla take this one first.
Alrighty, so I think any teacher you ask, you might get different answers to why they left. Mine is quite different than Molly's and Lauren's, but I was a teacher in Texas, so my family, we moved to Louisiana. In order for me to continue teaching, I would have to get certified in the state of Louisiana to be able to teach here. And I wanted to take the opportunity to get into higher education and working with college athletes to hopefully get them to be able to graduate when they're here for their 4 years, now 5 with COVID, but when they're here for those years, to graduate with a degree and leave with a degree, not just be here for 4 years or 5 years and not end up with anything other than their high school degree. So that is why I chose to come into higher education. I wanted to take this opportunity as my family was making the transition to come out of teaching and be able to apply what I learned from teaching and be able to apply from my experience as a student athlete and kind of combine them together to help the student athletes that I could, to the fullest potential. I enjoyed teaching when I was teaching. I enjoyed where I was teaching at, and getting to know all the kids and their families and their and their parents. So that's why I left the classroom. I will let Molly take the next one, and then we'll finish with more.
Perfect. So like Priscilla said, we all kind of have a different story, just like most teachers do leaving the classroom. I loved my school as well. I found that I really wanted to be working with students on a bit more personal level. I found that using the school I was at, using the scripted curriculums didn't really allow me the space to really meet my students where they were and address those holistic things that were going on, address like their mental well-being, those kinds of things. And so that's what drove me to pursue my master's in school counseling. That allowed me to get a graduate assistantship here. I originally thought that maybe being an academic advisor was something that I might be interested in. And then I found out what a learning specialist did. And I found that it was the perfect blend of really the school counseling piece, that one-on-one piece, that checking in on their mental well-being, helping them adapt to the life's challenges, combined with those teaching skills was really a perfect fit. And I also just saw in school counseling, we learn a lot about the standards we want students to meet before they graduate. And I found that a lot of times we get them all the way up to graduation, and then the support kind of drops off. So I thought it was really important to be working at this level and understanding that while we strive to get these kids to meet literacy or math standards or those academic skills standards before they graduate high school, that doesn't always happen. So making sure that they have support after they leave that setting.
And then my little story, I guess, is I absolutely loved my students at my former institution. Unfortunately, I did start to see an increase in the occurrences of students being underserved, and then ultimately underprepared for their next steps. The institution continued kind of on a little track of inaction, and that combined with finding out about our bridge program for incoming student athletes, learning what a learning specialist actually is. I had never heard of that title prior to 2019, to be totally honest, but finding out about that, seeing the effort that people made here to truly close the gaps and things like that for students who, through no fault of their own, have these gaps, or who have undiagnosed learning disabilities or struggles and things like that. That led to me finding and taking this opportunity to move to the learning specialist side. So yeah, but with that, we do want to open it up for anybody who may have any kind of questions about a teacher and what they're doing to make the transition, what you would want to ask a teacher, or how to ask a teacher questions, or just what concerns and questions you have about considering a teacher for a position in this field.
If you guys have any questions, feel free to just type them in the chat, or maybe raise a hand so we can facilitate that. But as you guys are writing those questions, we are going to put up our emails here if you want to reach out to any of us, and maybe you guys are going through a hiring process and maybe have a couple of teachers applying, and you might want to ask what are some things we should ask them, or if you know of a teacher who wants to get into this field and may want to know how do I expand on the skills that I already have, and how do they transfer to a learning specialist? What would be the best way to do that? We said, all three of us have education backgrounds. We will all be learning specialists come next week. So, feel free to ask us that. I am going to put up a QR code because I know that we do have to do an evaluation of our session here for the Student Support Summit. So we'll leave that there. We'll stay on for a few more minutes. If you have any questions, just let us know. But if not, thank you for coming to our presentation. I know it is 3 o'clock on a Friday, and it's close to being done for the day and the weekend. So we appreciate you guys just coming and listening.